Ako po si Johnny Gomez ng SOS, Serbisyo Ora Mismo Sigurado. Manood po kayo dito sa ating malayang talakayan, dito sa ating masiglang usapan. Tandaan po ninyo, layunin natin ang maiangat ang kaalaman ng ating mga kababayan sa katwiran at karapatan. Nationwide and worldwide, mapapanood at mapakikinggan sa DZRJ 8:10 AM ang Radyo Bandido TV.
Watch and listen to SOS, Servicio Ora Mismo Sigurado, Monday to Friday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Airing on Sky Cable Channel 224 and on all DTT boxes. Simulcasting online on Facebook and YouTube. Listen and watch on your mobile devices. Just search DZRJ Radio Bandido. You are watching the multi-awarded Radio Bandido TV on Channel 224 Sky Cable and TV Plus boxes. Simulcast on DZRJ 8:10 AM. Informing, advising, and entertaining the Filipinos and OFWs around the world. Streaming live on www.facebook.com/DZRJ 8:10 AM or on YouTube, channel DZRJ 8:10 AM Radio Bandido.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.
My name is 𝗪cie𝗿𝗀𝗱.
Hello, Philippines, and welcome to the World News Jam here on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV. I am Eric Lecain, coming to you live from the beautiful Makati, Manila. We here at the Jam talk about what's going on around the world, the biggest stories that have been happening outside of the Philippines, so you can stay informed. Now, today, we're going to be talking about those tariffs and the protests and the speeches going on there in the United States and the problems going on in Syria this week, the issue of the death penalty by firing squad in the U.S., and a follow-up to that mysterious passing of the actor Gene Hackman, his wife, and their dog. Now, let's talk a little bit about these tariffs we keep hearing about. Now, a tariff is a tax that's put on a product that comes into a country. So let's say you're in the U.S. and you order something from Canada, and when that item gets to the border, the U.S. buyer needs to pay the taxes on that item to bring it into the country. So you pay your tax. Now, let's say you want to sell that item to someone in the U.S., such as a customer in your store. You don't want to lose money on that item, so you want to make money, so you charge the customer the price of the item plus the price of the tariff. Now, President Trump is putting a 25% tax on all items coming in from Canada and Mexico, so the final consumer is the one actually paying that 25% tax, which is kind of a lot. But why would Trump do this if the U.S. consumer is the one to actually be paying the tariff tax? Well, the idea is that the U.S. consumer won't want to pay the 25% tax, so they won't buy Canadian products and instead will choose to buy American products. But what about things that you just can't buy that are made in the U.S.? Things like the parts that you use to build a car. Many of the biggest car makers in the U.S. buy the parts for those cars in Canada and Mexico. In fact, some of those parts go over the border 3 or 4 times in the process of being built. So, for example, those cars are going way up in price. A car that costs you $30,000 could be $40,000 by next week. This is not only bad for Canada, but it's even worse for the U.S. I mean, are people going to want to buy less cars now? So, who are these tariffs good for? Who do the tariffs really help? Well, if you're not going to buy an American-made car with parts manufactured in Canada, well, you might want to take a look at a Korean car or maybe a Japanese car. Those countries don't have tariffs. when those cars come into the country, they are the same prices they were before. In essence, the U.S. is tariffing itself, and the only ones to benefit are Asian countries. This is why so many companies and officials are begging Trump not to impose these tariffs. Now, he first imposed the tariffs a month ago, but then delayed the tariffs for 30 days to see if Canada and Mexico would do what he wanted in regards to immigration and fentanyl trafficking. Now, they seem to do exactly what he was asking. But now time is up and Trump is still not satisfied. He said he's definitely going to slap these tariffs on them, but in the last minute before the tariffs were about to take effect, well, Trump lifted the tariffs again, especially on certain big ticket items. But now, why would he do that? Mostly because of who hates tariffs the most. You know who hates tariffs the most? The U.S. stock market, that's who. Yes, the good old stock market jumped off the cliff last week. Took a major dive once it seemed as if Trump was going to do these tariffs. But then he backtracked. But was he going to backtrack again? So everyone's all freaking out now. No one can really tell what Trump will do next. Even many of his own officials are not exactly sure. Many are asking, why is he doing this really? Well, Canadians believe he's trying to weaken the Canadian economy so that he can annex the entire country and make it the 51st state of the United States. Would the U.S. do something like this? Probably not. But would Trump? Maybe he would if he could. You could see how Trump would want to. I mean, according to Canada, they trade more with the U.S. than the U.S. does with China, the U.K., Australia, France, and Germany combined. Trade is worth billions. You can imagine what that would be worth if Trump could take over that country and make it part of the United States. I guess in Trump's mind, it would be a great plan. But what Trump wasn't thinking about was that Canada was not too keen on the idea of being taken over by its neighbor. They don't want to be known as the state of Canada. So they did the same thing back to the United States. They imposed their own tariffs starting last week, going after things like wine and beer and hard alcohol, coffee and orange juice, cosmetics, motorcycles. But why is Canada doing this when Trump has already backed down for the second time? Because, according to Canada, the damage is already done. Canada seems to be tired of playing this game with Trump. So basically they said, if you want a war, you got one. Bars and restaurants are already removing all American products from their menus, saying they are not putting them back. Grocery stores are removing American foods from their shelves and not putting them back. They are saying that no one is going to buy an American car there ever again. America's been a friend to Canada for so many years, and Trump has ruined that friendship in just 1 week. Most Canadian officials say that they are not angry with the people of the U.S. However, quoting a Canadian official, the Americans were stupid to vote such a fool into office. There's a new sticker going around Canada that you can put on the bumper of your car or your backpack. Has a picture of the number 51 on it and a line through it. Now, Canada is already bringing in relief measures, such as those used in COVID to help local business owners with the shock that's about to hit them. Most are scared to buy anything or stock up on any certain products because if you stock them at a premium and the price goes down, because no one knows what Trump will do next. But one thing is for sure right now, if there's a made in USA label on an item, probably no one will buy it anymore in Canada. Most Canadians don't even really understand why Trump is doing this. He keeps saying it's the fentanyl problem. But is it? The amount of fentanyl crossing the border is less than 1% of the total amount believed to be coming into the country. So almost no one believes fentanyl is the reason Trump is doing this. Right now, according to the polls, the discontent of the U.S. and Canada is at an all-time high, seeing as the U.S. has been a close ally of Canada for over 100 years. But not only is the people's hatred of the U.S. at an all-time high, but also their allegiance to their home country, Canada. Right now, it's the highest ever seen in a lifetime. People of Canada seem to be bearing their differences and putting all their bad feelings all on the U.S. Right now, Canada has put a tariff of $30 billion worth of goods coming from the U.S., and this is just the first part of a $155 billion tariff, which will go into effect if Trump doesn't pull his tariffs first. Trump did say last week that he will remove all tariffs if Canada removes theirs first, but Canada is not stupid. I'm sure they're going to want conditions that Trump won't do this ever again. So at current, it looks as if Trump has lost the tariff war with Canada before it even started. But I can almost guarantee that this war is not over. The Canadians are pretty moose mad about all of this. Right now, the consensus is that Canada needs to find some new friends somewhere else, maybe across the Atlantic, because Canada feels like someone just stabbed them in the back, and it was their best friend. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam, talking about stories going on around the world right here on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. One of the other groups that is not currently happy with President Trump and his new policies are the people of the U.S. This week, protests were ongoing all around the country. First, they protested outside the offices of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that the office that tries to predict the weather and charts patterns of climate, especially when it comes to things like hurricanes and tsunamis and tornadoes. So why are people protesting in front of the weather agency? Well, Trump this week fired a lot of employees there. In fact, all of the probationary employees. But like I explained on past shows, many of those people have been in the agency for 10 years or more. It's just that they just switched jobs. So it looks like they've only been there a few years. The problem is, many of these people have very specialized work that comes with decades of expertise and institutional knowledge. Someone from the agency said, "These indiscriminate cuts are cruel and thoughtless. Words can't describe the impact this will have both on us at NOAA and on the country." They continue, "There is no plan or thought into how to continue to deliver science or service on weather, severe storms and events, conservation and management of our coasts and ocean life, and much more. Let's not pretend this is about efficiency, quality of work, or cost savings, because none of those false justifications are remotely true." There were many protests outside of NOAA this week. And as usual, lawyers and officials are saying these firings and layoffs are completely illegal. And there were protests at the Office for Veteran Affairs. Seems thousands of jobs disappeared this week in the Veterans Office, and more are coming. One of the protest signs read, "Betrayed," and "Trump hates veterans." They're being displayed by people marching outside the Veterans Office. One veteran who was fired is quoted as saying, "I think a lot of other veterans who voted the same way as me, and we have been betrayed. I feel like my life and the lives of so many like me, so many that have sacrificed so much for this country, are being destroyed." End quote. Turns out that 30% of federal workforce is made up of veterans. And right now, in the Virginia Office of Veterans, they are talking about the possibility of firing 80,000 workers, many of which voted for Trump in the last election. And there was another protest, but this was a transgender unity rally in Washington, D.C. They marched from the U.S. Capitol to the White House, holding bright signs and wearing bright clothes. This was in protest to Trump's new executive order targeting the transgender community, mostly about the stoppage of giving out life-saving drugs through the U.S. aid program to women, children, and men who have AIDS. They said these drugs keep people alive and that these new policies will indeed kill people. And also the executive order saying that from now on in the U.S., there is only two genders and you can't legally change your gender. That one of those policies is just meant to discriminate. One speaker at that protest said they are now deciding how to deny visas to people who want to come to World Pride here in Washington, D.C. They continued, they do not want transgender people coming to Washington, and they don't want transgender people coming to Los Angeles as athletes or even as spectators for the Olympics in 2028. They are working on that now, how to keep trans people out of America, even as visitors. Another gave a colorful speech saying, as individuals in our various communities and workplaces, I encourage all of you to be as irritating and hard to remove as a pebble in their shoe, a grain of sand in their eye, or even better, glitter. Trump is not a king. Elon is not our president. I call on all of you to resist in any way you can, big or small, be the glitter they cannot get rid of, and never let anyone dull your shine. End quote. Hundreds marched up Constitution Avenue, holding up signs and carrying rainbow flags. It was a scene. Also, many people protesting Tesla dealerships this week. Graffiti was sprayed on dealership signs. A series of Molotov cocktails were thrown into dealers' lots. Also, Tesla's charging stations, some people set them on fire. But mostly just people with signs marching in front of Tesla's office building, Elon Musk's new role as the head of the Doge program, and his responsibility of cutting the jobs of many hardworking Americans in order to pay for the tax cuts of the billionaires like him, or something like that. Many of the vandals are saying they are just exercising their right to free speech. It's kind of a jab at Elon Musk, who's always talking about the government taking away people's right to free speech. Recently, Musk did something after he spoke at one of the events, which looked a lot like a Nazi salute. So many people are painting the word Nazi on his buildings. But some of this is getting really serious. People shooting up Tesla cars that are in the lots. In New York this week, so many showed up at the Tesla protest that arrests had to be made. Elon has caused a lot of anger recently with his firing of some 60 to 70,000 federal jobs this week in the U.S. And of course, his statements in front of a hardcore right-wing German political party speech in which he said that children should not be guilty of the sins of their parents, let alone their grandparents. I guess you realize he's talking about the Nazis, right? Speaking of Nazis, Musk did speak out recently about the people attacking his dealership, saying damaging property of others, aka vandalism, is not free speech. But this is not the only problem Musk is having. There were even worse protests at his SpaceX headquarters in California, another company owned by Musk. There you could see a man dressed like a Darth Vader version of Elon Musk, holding up a sign that said, Donald Trump, I am your daddy. So besides Elon Musk, people are also, across the country, protesting the firing of people who run the national public parks. They hung an upside-down flag on the Golden Gate Bridge. Actually, here were 100 different protests across parks in the United States just this week with signs saying, save our parks. You see, there have been mass terminations from the National Parks Department forcing some parks to close because no one is left to attend to them. And the parks that are open are leaving no cleaning crews for the hiking trails, the camping areas, or the toilets. At the famous park in Yosemite where the El Capitan Summit is, a group of laid-off employees hung an upside-down flag off the 3,000-foot vertical rock formation. Right now, that long line's getting into the parks, and many sites are already falling into disarray. Many believe that several national parks will need to close soon if jobs are not restored. And in the middle of all this, Vice President J.D. Vance decided to take a vacation in Vermont at one of the ski parks. Well, guess who was there to greet Mr. Vance? Many, many angry people. They held protests in every part of J.D. Vance's ski trip, from the day he got there until the day he left. As he drove up, he could see signs such as, "Vance is a traitor. Please go ski in Russia." And "Vance disgraces our country." This was in reference to Vance's new friendship with Vladimir Putin. But many of these protests around the country have not gone unnoticed. For instance, this week, the Trump administration pulled $400 million in federal funding from Columbia University for allowing what it calls illegal protest in the war of Gaza. Students there have been protesting the killing of some 50,000 Palestinians in Gaza, and the Trump administration is siding with Netanyahu of Israel. The New York Civil Liberties Union has said that this move by Trump is illegal in that it's a move to coerce colleges and universities into censoring student speech and advocacy that isn't MAGA approved, like criticizing Israel or supporting Palestinian rights. So in any case, many in the U.S. are standing up to the president this week to show their disapproval. Is Trump listening? Well, probably not. But there have been some slight pushbacks coming from the Republican officials, but they use very careful words when they talk, and mostly against the firings done by Elon Musk because their voters back in their home states are not happy. But right now, Republicans don't dare speak out against Trump. They might become the next federal employee on Elon Musk's chopping block. But besides all these protests, there are protests against someone else. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. People in states across all of the U.S. are protesting Putin, or rather the new stance the U.S. has in its relationship with Putin. If we remember on last week's show, we talked about Trump and J.D. Vance ambushing the president of Ukraine and what was supposed to be just a photo op before the President Zelensky was about to sign a document giving Trump 50% of its mineral deposits in exchange for U.S. support. Well, of course, that document was never signed because at that photo op, Vance and Trump started saying things that were sounding like they were going into a partnership agreement with Russia and not the Ukraine. And Zelensky stood to the ambush and then was asked to leave the White House. Also, let's not forget, there were negotiations set up to figure out a ceasefire between the Ukrainians and the Russians in Saudi Arabia, but the Ukrainians were not even invited to that. And this week, things seem to be even getting worse between the two. First off, the Trump administration ordered a pause on military aid to Ukraine as the administration carries out a review. And then out of nowhere, Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense, ordered the U.S. Cyber Command to cease offensive cyber operations and information operations against Russia, which made a lot of officials in the U.S. say, "What?" Also, Pam Bondi, the new Trump-appointed Attorney General, disbanded efforts to seize the assets of Russian oligarchs, thus breaking up the Biden-era programs known as Task Force Kleptocatcher and the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative. In a separate directive, Bondi ordered a halt to a federal law enforcement combats secret influence campaigns by the Russians, China, and other traditional U.S. adversaries that attempt to sow division in the U.S. politics. This is despite years of warning by the U.S. intelligence agencies that foreign companies malign, influence operations involving disinformation that were growing and a dangerous threat to the U.S. But some of these have come at the oddest times. Russia has recently, according to reports, upped its cyber spying, hacking, and election interference in both Europe and the U.S. So why is Trump all of a sudden taking down the most sophisticated group in the world to stop these kind of attacks? Why? Well, Secretary of State Rubio, he said, you're not going to bring the Russians to the table if you're calling them names, if you're being antagonistic. That's just the president's instincts from years and years of putting deals together, end quote. Of course, the head of the Democrat in the Senate spoke out saying this is a critical strategic mistake. It's like giving a free pass as Russia continues to launch cyber operations and ransomware attacks against critical American infrastructure. Speaking of Russian spying and hacking, Trump gave a speech this week, kind of like a State of the Union address, 1 hour and 40 minutes long. And one of the subjects in that speech was something I've been asked about so many times this week: the new American Gold Card. In the speech, Trump talked about the new Gold Card. Basically, it's a new pathway to citizenship in America. Just one catch: it costs $5 million, or 286 million pesos. He said it's like a green card, but better and more sophisticated. He said, we will reduce our debt with that money. Now, just to be clear, the U.S. debt is now at $36 trillion. So how many gold cards would you need to sell to even put a dent in that? The answer is a lot. But moreover, who do you think would be the first in line to get such a card? Who would have $5 million to put into a gold card for citizenship? Russian oligarchs, maybe, who want to come into the country to launder money. Currently cannot do that because of U.S. sanctions. Oh, yeah, Trump is trying to do away with the U.S. sanctions to Russia. Trump also had some very interesting things to say in his speech to Congress that we kind of forget about. He brought up Greenland again. He has said that in the past, he would use the military to force Greenland to give up its country to the U.S. But many still believe it was just Trump's bluster and that it wasn't so real. But in his speech, he continued down this path. He said, I have a message tonight for the incredible people of Greenland. We strongly support your right to determine your own future, and if you choose, we welcome you to the United States of America. But then he said, and I think we're going to get it one way or the other, we're going to get it. We will keep you safe, we will make you rich, and together we will take Greenland to heights like you have never thought possible before. It's a very small population, but very, very large piece of land and very, very important to our military security. End quote. Now, recent polling shows that 85% of the public in Greenland do not want to be part of the United States. Now, Trump has also said he's reclaiming the Panama Canal, that the U.S. was in the process of taking over the canal by buying the contracts from China. He said, we're already started doing it. We're taking it back. He was referring to the company BlackRock buying the contracts from the Hong Kong-based company. But the president of Panama said this is not true, that even though the company running the port will be an American company, the ownership of the Panama Canal is still and will always be Panama. That's according to their president. Trump also said he will be taking over another place, or at least planting an American flag there, and that would be Mars. Kind of an odd thing to bring up at this kind of speech, but okay. He said, "We are going to conquer the vast frontiers of science, and we are going to lead humanity into space and plant the American flag on the planet Mars and far beyond." Now, a lot of people said to notice that he pointed out the word conquer in that speech, not research or explore. In any case, Elon Musk was in the audience, giving Trump the big thumbs up. One of the more funny subjects, or maybe just to me, was that Trump mentioned the $8 million that President Biden spent on making mice transgender. Now, $8 million does sound like a lot to spend on making mice transgendered, if that's what they really did. But in reality, that was not what they did. The $8 million was spent on transgenic mice. This is a study of changing the DNA structure of a mouse so that it can be used to see how certain medications can affect the genes in a mouse. They use it to study aging, Alzheimer's disease, asthma, diabetes, heart disease, and Parkinson's disease. Many believe that Trump just mixed the words up somehow, or he didn't read it very carefully. But even so, he said he has put a stop to the funding of the research facilities that produce transgender mice, even though there's no such place and no such research. He also said that children will no longer be allowed to change their sex. He called on Congress to make it a crime to allow a child to change their sex. And according to Trump, we need to end that lie that a child is trapped in the wrong body. But there were some more important things mentioned in this speech. Trump said that President Zelensky had written him a nice letter and that he was ready to work with Trump. This very well might have been because Trump cut off the funding to the Ukraine, and since then, many Ukrainian soldiers have died. And a Ukrainian official said that as a result of this pause from the U.S. president in military support, there are hundreds of dead Ukrainians now. Also, the U.S. has suspended all intelligence gathering that's going to the Ukraine. The U.S. has incredible abilities to gather intelligence, mostly from the satellites going on there above the earth. So the U.S. has been able to tell the Ukrainians exactly where the Russians are. This is huge that they no longer have this. It takes away the Ukrainians' ability to launch long-range and mid-range missiles. This may have been the breaking point for the Ukrainians, taking away the military support, the weapons, the intelligence. It's opened a massive door to Putin that he did not have before. Maybe Zelensky is realizing he may not have any other choice but to work with Trump to end this war. Also, if Trump can end this war, then that'll be a giant notch in his belt, help push his want to get a Nobel Peace Prize. But what if he makes the war worse and a lot more people die? In the meantime, we wait, we watch as all these things Trump is throwing up in the air all at once. And if and when some of those things will come back and hit the ground, I just hope as a planet we can make it before he's done with us. And this is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. Remember when we talked about the al-Assad regime several months ago? Well, the rebels, they were finally able to take over the country, and the brutal regime of al-Assad was over. He had to escape to Russia under the protection of Putin. Seemed as if Syria had finally found peace. Well, not exactly. It's a little bit of a apprehension about the rebels that took over the country, that they might not be much better than the previous rulers. Well, this past week, armed men loyal to that government decided the country needed purifying. So they went from home to home, seeking out people that were believed to be in the previous regime. Last Thursday, during their search, They would find men or boys they believed to be loyal to al-Assad, and they would pull them out of their house, make comments or curse them, and then shoot them. They claimed they were putting down an insurgency. However, many described it as communal killings. The Syrian Network for Human Rights said that at least 642 people have died in the violence since last week, including many civilians who were thought to side with al-Assad, but were simply born in a similar sect. And because of that, they were executed in the streets. The current leader has called for national unity and called the clashes expected challenges. He said he will form an independent committee and have the matter investigated. But one of the residents who escaped said the armed men were going from house to house attacking people as a form of what looked like entertainment. He said they declared jihad on us. People were fleeing as the attacks came, but if you could not run away for whatever reason, most likely you are dead now. The problem is that if you were born into the same sect as the Assad family, you were considered an enemy of the new government, who are the Sunnis. Now, the new leader, who's in charge of Syria until there's an election, has said that this would not happen, that the al-Ta'i sect would have representation in the government and security. But ever since the Sunnis took over, there has been distrust between them and the Alawites. Supposedly this week, the Alawites attacked and killed members of the sect that took over the government. But those rebels are well hidden away and definitely not in the neighborhoods that they were being attacked. The armed men who just pulling out and killing civilians who had nothing to do with any of this fighting. The idea now is that the purification of the country, and that means to kill all the Alawites. One of the men of the convoy said it was a battle for liberation. Now it's a battle for purification. To the Alawites, we're coming to slaughter you and your fathers. Everyone is going out with guns, and we will show you the strength of the Sunnis. The thing that is that several of the killings are put on video. You can see the horrible ways in which the killings were carried out. That includes what the men were saying to the people that they were about to kill. It's really hard stuff to watch. So much hatred toward those Alawites, because even though they make up a small part of the population, they were much of a higher social standing during the time when al-Assad was in power. The hatred of those people has been building up for many decades, and so now they are enjoying killing them. The big question now is, what will the new government do to stop the killing of civilians? Will they stop it, or will they just let it be? And will they allow this to continue until the country is purified of all the Alawites? This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam, live in Makati, Manila, talking about stories going on around the world. The death penalty. It's been a debate throughout our modern times. Should there be a thing as legal murder? Now, in the Philippines, the death penalty has been the subject of conflict with an act of Congress overwhelmingly voting to abolish it in the signing of the Republic Act of 9346 on June 24, 2006. All death sentence inmates had their sentences commuted to life in prison. Now, before this, there was a death penalty for certain crimes. For a while in the 50s, electrocution was the main penalty for death sentence. And in the 1970s, the Marcos administration instituted the firing squad as a means of execution. But in general, except for under Marcos, which had 32 executions in his long tenure as president, the number of executions in the Philippines was very limited, very small. That's according to all the records I found. But in the U.S., these numbers are extremely different. Whereas in the Philippines, mostly it's less than 10 in a president's term. In the U.S., there have been a total of 1,613 executions since 1976. And this is in the form of lethal injection, electrocution, lethal gas, hanging, and firing squad. Now, Actually, that firing squad, it's the least amount. You don't have a lot of executions in the U.S. by firing squad. Supposedly, since 1608, there have been 140 American inmates executed by firing squad. Of course, we don't know how many exactly military personnel were killed in the Civil War due to the desertion by firing squad. But the last time someone was executed in the U.S. by that method was 2010. That's 15 years ago. That is until last week in South Carolina. Brad Sigmund, now 61 years old, had a girlfriend back in 1999 to 2001. They lived together in his trailer in South Carolina. However, his girlfriend, named Barbara, ended their relationship and moved back in with her parents. But Brad loved her and refused to give up on the relationship. He used to drive by where she was living to see if she had another boyfriend. He was obsessed with getting her back in his life, so he made a plan to go to her parents' house when she was at work and tie up her parents, and then later kidnap his ex-girlfriend. Try to talk some sense into her. But when he went there to carry out his plan, things went horribly wrong. He ended up crushing the skull of both her mother and father in a wild and brutally violent act of double murder, and then stealing the father's gun and waiting in the house with the two dead bodies for his ex-girlfriend to arrive. When his ex, Barbara, finally got home, he grabbed her and forced her into her car and then planned to drive to his car where they would switch cars and then he would drive to North Carolina. However, she jumped out of the car and then ran away. He managed to shoot her, but she still got away. While in the hospital, she gave her account of what happened to the police. And for 11 days, they searched for Brad, eventually finding him in Tennessee. State authorities returned him to South Carolina to face murder charges in which the state would eventually seek the death penalty. At the trial, he pleaded guilty. I mean, it was hard to plead anything else. He hoped for mercy with his guilty plea. Usually with a guilty plea, there's some kind of deal to avoid the death penalty. In fact, his attorney claimed his drug issues were to blame for the murder. And of course, a love for his ex-girlfriend. But the jury did not show mercy after the condition of the parents, and they voted in favor of execution. But with any execution, things get a little bit complicated. After all his appeals were exhausted, he was set to die in 2021. However, there was a stay on his execution because the drugs to be used in the execution were expired, and the suppliers of the drugs refused to make any more drugs that would be used for an execution. So, the state reintroduced the electric chair and the firing squad as an alternative method to him being executed. However, by 2023, the state had acquired a new set of lethal injection drugs. But in the middle of this, Brad filed a lawsuit against the use of the electric chair and the firing squad, which was still being heard. So another stay was put in place and the execution was moved again. That lawsuit was eventually dismissed. So the execution was back on, set for December 24th. Then another suit was filed in that he said you should not let anyone be executed during the holiday season. The suit said that no one should have to be executed around the Christmas season. So the court said, okay. Then the execution was moved to March 7th, 2025. Another appeal was filed to hear more evidence about his brain damage, his mental illness, and his childhood traumas, which would make him ineligible to be executed. But that appeal was dismissed, and the execution was back on. So when it came time to pick a method of his own death, he decided he did not want electrocution because he had the idea it would burn him and cook him alive. He also worried that lethal injection would take 20 minutes and he would be in prolonged agony. So he decided on death by firing squad. So the state of South Carolina had to renovate the death chamber to cater to the firing squad because it had never been used for that. They tried appeals all the way up to the Supreme Court. However, all were rejected. Nothing worked. So on the day of the execution, protesters stood outside the prison and held up signs proclaiming all life is precious, no more killing. The evening before the execution, Brad had requested to have a KFC meal with mashed potatoes and green beans. And that would be his last meal. The firing squad consisted of 3 people with rifles all loaded with live rounds. The audience would not be able to see who was firing the rifles and could only see the side of Brad's head, which was covered with a black hood. In his final statement read by his lawyer, he said, "I want my closing statement to be one of love and calling to my fellow Christians to help us to end the death penalty. Nowhere does God in the New Testament give man authority to kill another man." So on March 7th, 2025, Brad Sigmund was strapped into a chair and 3 men with high-powered rifles stood 15 feet away. When the signal was given, all 3 shooters fired at the same time at the heart of Brad. There was a slight flinch and then no movement. He seemed to have lost consciousness in a split second. After the shots were fired, there was silence and no one said a word. The doctor checked him about 2 minutes later, and he was pronounced dead. When you think about it, at first, the firing squad seems to be brutal and inhumane. But compared to the slow death of the lethal injection or being electrocuted, it actually seems like it might be the best way to go. I guess the only other choice would be to not do the death penalty at all. But that's for another discussion on another day. And this is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio right here in Makati, Manila. Continuing on a more similar subject, I wanted to update you on a story we did last week on the mysterious death of Academy Award-winning actor Gene Hackman. His wife and their dog, all 3, found dead in their home in New Mexico. They had all been dead for around 10 days, it was thought. But when investigators could not figure out why they all died, there was no evidence of forced entry, no evidence of gas or carbon monoxide, no wounds on the body. So how could they all have died at the same time? Well, it turns out they didn't. Before I explained how this tragedy happened, I need to first talk about a disease called hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. It's a strain of viruses carried by rodents. It can be transferred to a human simply by breathing in the fumes from the rodent's urine or saliva or droppings. Usually it's a deer mouse. Now the symptoms can take up to 2 months to appear, but once they do, you may think you have the flu, as it has fatigue and fever, muscle aches, coughing, shortness of breath. Then after 3 to 6 days, you will develop fluid in your lungs. At this point, you can die very quickly and suddenly. There's no cure for hantavirus. However, once you realize you have it, you need to get to a hospital because a little less than half the people that get the virus die from it. And it turns out this is what Gene Hackman's wife, 𝗪cie𝗪𝗪, died from. She was found in the bathroom, and it looked as if she just fell over dead. She was laying right next to the space heater. It seemed as if her lungs just shut down at that very moment. The problem that Betsy had was she was the sole caregiver of her husband, Gene Hackman, who was suffering from advanced Alzheimer's. According to the investigators, she had a short email exchange with her massage therapist that morning and then later visited the farmer's market and then the pharmacy and then the dog food store. And later that day, none of her emails had been answered or even opened. So it's believed that she died on February 11th. However, her husband of 30 years, Gene Hackman, died on February 18th. They know this because on that day, his pacemaker recorded his heart stopping. He died from atherosclerotic disease, basically a heart attack. His pacemaker recorded that he was experiencing arterial fibrillation on February 18th, and then his heart stopped. Then they were both found with their dog, who also died, on February 26th. Authorities believe that due to his advanced Alzheimer's, he didn't even know his wife was dead all that time. He may have wandered around the house for a week, never even noticing her. When they finally found him, he was in really bad shape. There was no food in his stomach. Hackman was at the stage in his Alzheimer's where he could not have made a phone call, could not have been able to open a door by himself. The dog was in a dog carrier the dog could not get out of. It looks like she came in with the dog and just set him down. The dog is believed to have died from starvation. But the thing that still puzzles investigators is that Hackman's wife should have been feeling sick leading up to her death. But when they looked into the CCTV cameras in the drugstore, she looked okay. It's more than likely she had been sick for weeks but didn't see a doctor. Investigators also looked for signs of a rodent in the house, which there was little evidence of, but they did find some. So far, it seems as if this is how the few weeks played out. So it's the end of the mystery. Gene Hackman was 95 while his wife was 65. They were a product of a romance that just never ended. Even though he was a famous movie star, they lived a simple life in a simple place. He painted and sketched and tooled with his pickup trucks, and she looked after him. A friend said Betsy was a wonderful wife. They were very close, and she was a good cook and really, really took good care of him. They ate very well, and he was doing fine, even though he had triple bypass when he was 60 years old. But they had been in really good health since then, and I'm sure she was one of those factors why. They both loved animals and had 3 dogs. 2 of the dogs were able to go outside and were found in good health. After COVID, friends said that they didn't see much of the couple because she was so careful to make sure he didn't get sick. But ironically, she was the one that got sick. Now, personally, I've experienced someone with Alzheimer's, and it can be difficult to understand how something like this could happen unless you've been around it. They can't remember anything, how to use a fork, how to speak, how to open the door. I can sort of imagine how this all happened. But they were together until the very end. Pianist 𝗪cie 𝗪𝗀𝗱, dead at 65, and Academy Award-winning actor Gene Hackman at 95. He was one of my favorite actors. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam. Thank you so much for joining us here, talking about interesting stories going on around the world. Please join us again next week here on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV for more World News Jam. Until then, everyone be safe out there, and we will see you next week.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.